You're live. Good evening, everyone. It is Wednesday, December the 8th, 2021, and welcome to Black Men Speak. If it is Wednesday and if it's 8 o'clock Central Time, it is Black Men Speak. Welcome, everyone, and we want to thank you for joining our show this evening. On behalf of myself and Jimmy Stewart. By the way, everyone, just as an FYI, Jimmy, a little bit under the weather this week, so he will definitely be with us today, but he will not be our co-host for today, and we definitely prayerfully see that he will get back to 100% and will be joining us next week. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about one of the most highly publicized cases recently. It looks like we may have a little feedback or background noise, but the Ahmaud Arbery case. For those of you who have been paying attention in the news, we know that there was a conviction in the trial of the McMichaels and William Bryan in the Ahmaud Arbery case, and we have one of our legal experts and brilliant minds in Mr. Russell Wilson, trial attorney, lead attorney of the law office of Russell Wilson, who is joining us tonight again to discuss the fallout and the outcome of the Ahmaud Arbery case and see where that takes us. Because quite frankly, folks, yes, there is a conviction, but this is nowhere close to over. So, Brother Wilson, if you could just say hello and introduce yourself very briefly, and then we will move forward with the show.
Yeah, no, thank you again for having me on the show. As you mentioned, my name's Russell Wilson. I practice here in the North Texas area in state and federal courts, and formerly in the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. I've served as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney. And so, I look forward to our discussion this evening on Ahmaud Arbery and maybe a few kind of collateral criminal justice issues that come up out of this case.
Sounds good. And by the way, I don't know if that is on my side, but I am still getting a little feedback here, but I will move forward. So before we get started with the show, folks, you have two options for checking out tonight's show. First is bmstalkshow.com. That is bmstalkshow.com. Or, of course, YouTube Live. Most of you are probably listening on YouTube Live. Feel free to chat and let us know if you have any questions or thoughts that you would like us to discuss this evening while I'm talking to Counselor Wilson. Also, if you would like to join in and ask a question, you can give us a call. The conference bridge is provided in YouTube Live at the very bottom, but that number is 562-232-9097, PIN number 130-485-451. Look for the conference bridge if you would like to call in, join us tonight, and join into the conversation. And then also, at the end of the day, folks, we ask that you understand that we are here to provide information to help summarize and make things simpler for us, especially for situations like this where we may not be the experts or the SMEs in this area, but to give you the information that you need to go out to have the accurate information when you're having conversations at the office or at home, folks. And of course, we focus on those issues that impact our community. So let's move forward. So I'll start off with a general question and we'll get to specifics. So, Counselor, if you could tell us a little bit about what your general thoughts are on the outcome of this particular case. We've had obviously a lot of high profile cases, but share us your thoughts from a legal perspective of how this played out in the courts, even in the public eye, compared to other high-profile cases, like, of course, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others.
Right. Well, um, I thought that the Ahmaud Arbery case was going to be a very difficult case for the defense. And a lot of that lay in the way that the offenses were charged. They were charged with felony murder and this malice murder, both of which carried life sentences. And in general, when you're charged with committing murder multiple ways, it makes it more difficult to be successful in trying to defend those charges. So, my initial impression was that the defense was going to have a tough time. And that was just based off of the charges. Because the way they were charged, there were different junctures, if you will, in their interaction where the various laws were going to come into play.
Now, if I recall, there were 9 different charges. If I'm correct,
Right.
9 different charges.
Right, 9 different charges. The first was malice murder, and then you had felony murder, which basically means that if you're in the commission of a felony and that leads to a person's death, then even if you didn't intend to cause their death, you can be found guilty of felony murder. And so some people may be familiar with that from seeing a person who's evading the police and hit and kill somebody. They're not intending to kill that person or person. It's very, capital murder. It could be a robbery where you're in the course of a robbery, but felony murder could be any underlying felony as long as you're not actually intending to kill the person. And I think that was important here because it cast a broader net than just the criminal liability of the person shooting the gun. It made the other folks liable as well, and it held them accountable for their actions. So, start out with a broad charging document. I think the public was at times either frustrated or disappointed, or probably both, with the way that the defense went. One of the things that we probably have to keep in mind, of course, is every person who's charged with a crime, even if we, quote, the whole world knows they're guilty, is still entitled to a trial and entitled to effective assistance of counsel. There's kind of these constitutional things that actually, to me, probably better protect, the old days. If you go back to 1910, the lynching of black men in the streets, the Scottsboro boys, the men that were, whistled at the lady. So, right. We don't want to call for that, but, overall, I thought the trial went kind of as expected. It was, I was not surprised to see the defense try to either blame Ahmaud Arbery for his own death or try to raise self-defense. They weren't in a position where they could plead guilty and get a lesser sentence. I think they were trying to do whatever they could to try to defend the case.
Gotcha. It's interesting. There are a couple of things I'd like to ask. Because the public, not having a legal background, they just see murder as murder as murder, but there are different degrees of murder. So you mentioned felony murder, and we actually have a question from one of our viewers that maybe you can speak to. Is felony murder, easier to convict than murder one? Or kind of where is it in the rankings? Because you mentioned these different charges against them.
In this case, I would think the short answer is yes. Felony murder was easier um, because you didn't have to have a specific intent to kill. You just had to engage in conduct that caused the death. And so if you think of, the classic murder is, I'm going to kill you, points the gun at a person, it squeezes the trigger, and, the person hasn't been provoked, there's no justification, and just shoots them dead. Um, so it was easier here because you had to, again, encompass a broader range of conduct. So if you don't charge those offenses, if you just charge malice murder, then the jury wouldn't be able to find the person guilty, even if they believe you used the truck to help corner him, or that you know, restrained him, which resulted in an unlawful restraint. Any of those types of things. So no doubt, felony murder in this case was easier. I can't hear you. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
I know exactly why you couldn't hear me. I think that should be fixed. So you brought up an interesting point, and I think I speak on behalf of a lot of folks who aren't in the courts on a day-to-day basis when you said the ease of which this. Well, I don't want to say it was easy, but were you surprised by the outcome of this particular case in terms of a conviction? Because I know there were a lot of people who were on pins and needles as to what the outcome was going to be, even though it may have seemed like an obvious case to a lot of folks based upon the information that we had. A lot of
Right.
folks were very nervous.
Yeah, I mean, obviously people will get nervous about trials, um, but the overwhelming number of cases that are tried, I think, don't necessarily reach surprising results. Of course, you'd have to remember that in order for an acquittal to happen here, they would have had to have a unanimous jury. So 12 people have to vote for an acquittal. Um, it, so it seemed unlikely uh, in my mind, even regardless of the races of the jurors, that 12 people would agree to acquit all of these men. I did think that there might be more debate, and that bore out in the verdict regarding the neighbor, the what I would call the least culpable. And so, ultimately, that person, I think, probably should have requested or tried to do something to sever his trial. If you compare, for example, what happens when these folks are tried together to the officers in George Floyd's case, that severance is going to weigh very heavily in their favor. And here, it's going to give them more separation from, quote, the killer. And so you're able to uh, place substantial blame on the person directly responsible. And you can argue causation. You can argue a whole lot of things. So, that was the, the outcome. I think was not necessarily surprising. I think people that aren't familiar with the courts still, for justifiably so, still have a lack of confidence in the court system. And then there's just natural anxiety regarding any uncertainty. So, you know,
Now,
but
one thing I will say
go ahead.
about this particular case, when we compare it to um, a George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or any other cases, one big difference that a lot of folks see is that there was no law enforcement involved in the shooting per se, no active law enforcement. In your opinion, even though the circumstances may have been different, do you think that the fact that there was not law enforcement involved from a political perspective, did it make this conclusion any more or less difficult?
Well, yeah, I mean, the lack of law enforcement involvement So the short answer is yes. I think it makes it easier to convict. I think generally law enforcement is authorized to use deadly force in certain situations. And so that is the very reason we arm and train our police officers. And so there's an anticipation when you arm an officer that there will be instances that they will draw their guns and shoot and fire at citizens. So in that sense, that expectation is there. So their actions historically were less scrutinized because of that. In other words, when you're driving down the street, um, certainly in what I'll call the old days, you'd see police sirens and police with a person on the side of the road, and people would wonder what that person did. In that view, presumes the righteousness of the police officer engaging in the conduct, right? Well, he's justified in doing the stop and all these types of things. That carries over into shootings and other things. It carries over into all of their conduct. Society best capable of confidence.
I am having, I believe I have something on my side, and I hear some clicking on your side. Are you in front of a laptop or anything? I mean, obviously, you're watching on a laptop, but I was hearing some clicking.
I don't have anything clicking.
All right, cool. All right, let's move forward. As you were saying.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that you have this issue of societal confidence in law enforcement. That's not there when the person is not in law enforcement. So Joe Blow on the street, I don't think they get the same benefit that the law enforcement gets, the police officers, right? They're not sworn, they're not trained. So I don't believe that were this a police officer situation, that Ahmaud Arbery ends up dead, right? I mean, it's one thing to run from a pack of strangers chasing you. It's another to run from the police, and so presumably, if this was a uniformed police officer trying to make a stop, then Ahmaud Arbery either stops and talks to him, or if Ahmaud Arbery does keep running, he calls for additional backup. He recognizes that he's not armed. He has a stun gun with him, mace, and a whole host of tools that are considered less than lethal. And so I don't think Ahmaud Arbery happens if police are involved.
Got different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, entirely different.
That's good. I apologize for the background noise. I don't know why that's happening, but in terms of the defense of the case, and I found it pretty interesting, and maybe this is standard protocol, but the defense, if my understanding, built its case on the ability of the McMichaels and Mr. Bryan to, in essence, protect their ground, so to speak, make a citizen's arrest, and self-defense. That is, Travis McMichaels claimed that his life was threatened because of the potential of Mr. Arbery taking the gun that he had from him and killing him. And that was his reason for killing him, because he was afraid that Ahmaud Arbery, who was running away from him, was going to take the gun that he had and kill him.
Right. So that defense has been successful before in other cases. It's often used by police officers when they shoot unarmed people that are coming in proximity to them. It's used when there's kind of a 12-foot distance or 12-foot range that you get the police trying to say is what's a safe distance for the person to be at. So I think it wasn't necessarily surprised that they would use it. Again, the citizen doesn't get the same degree of deference that the police get. And so that's where I think that defense came from. And again, they weren't going to say guilty. We're guilty, and so it was up to them to try to come up with some type of defense. So it wasn't necessarily a surprise. They couldn't say he's not dead. He was dead. Couldn't say the things that you did didn't happen. So you were really left with saying we were doing it for a different reason.
Gotcha. So if you could share with us in layman's terms, what were the exact charges that they were convicted of, and what does that mean?
If we would just went down to layman's terms, I would probably just say they were convicted of murder.
But there are
one of them
murder.
Was right. One of them was malice murder. One of them was felony murder. At the end of the day, both of those convictions carry the same range of punishment, which is automatic life. So, two of the gentlemen were not convicted on the malice murder, but for all intents and purposes, the felony murder convictions carry life. The only question is life with parole or life without parole.
Okay.
And I don't know that the public, the distinction matters a whole lot.
Gotcha.
Because the punishment
is the same.
Is the same, right?
Now, what I and probably many people are reading in the papers is it says up to life. That's what I'm reading. It says up to life in prison. So what you're saying is it automatic or is it up to, and is there a minimum up to life?
Yeah, no, they're I don't practice in Georgia, so I'll say that, but I've read the Georgia statute. And it says life. The only question that the court is deciding is life with parole or life without parole.
Okay.
And that's what I expect to happen.
Gotcha. Do they get a chance after 20 years or whatever that looks like to get out?
So I think the answer to that is if they get life with parole, then they do get a chance to get out.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That makes sense. So kind of moving on from there. And that's just because when I'm reading it, it says up to life. So I have no idea what this particularly means. And so
this isn't going to be like I said, I don't practice in Georgia, but the statute says life.
Gotcha.
And, I don't see that there'll be a big issue on that.
One thing that I think also makes this case a little bit interesting is that, for those of us who remember this when it was really highly publicized, and when the murder initially took place, that the McMichaels and Mr. Bryan were out on the streets for quite a while. When, I guess for most folks, it was obviously seemingly what happened, but it was a couple of months. Matter of fact, I think it was over 2 months before there were any arrests that were made. And that brings up the question of a certain, I guess now former district attorney, who I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, has been indicted on this case, Jackie Johnson, who I believe at that time was the former district attorney. And now she has been implicated in some of the wrongdoing associated with it. So if you can kind of unpack and share with us your understanding on what happened, why it happened, and why she's potentially in trouble. I believe she's out on bond now.
Right. Yeah. So, this was probably, if anything, the definitely the unique component of this case. And if we're going to use a comparator, maybe we would say the Breonna Taylor case. So generally, a prosecutor has a whole lot of discretion in what they want to do in a particular case. They have very wide latitude. I believe this county, the prosecutors are elected. Here, I think Ms. Johnson knew some of the people involved. She wasn't straightforward regarding that.
Right. As a matter of fact, I believe one of them was an investigator in her office prior to retirement.
Right. And so she essentially tried to do, I think, some favors for them, is what the allegation would be.
Mhm.
And that whole favor was trying to avoid them getting charged. Then she tried to recommend another DA's office that she believed would not prosecute them, in essence. So if you go with your comparison, you go with Breonna Taylor, the state attorney general, really kind of setting up that case for a no deal or to avoid the charges being, leveled, coming down. Um, Even though it seemed like there might be a basis there to charge. And so, this is unique. This is, I'm not sure that I know of any uh, district attorney that's been prosecuted like that.
Mm.
And so this would be groundbreaking, though, I think, certainly in Georgia and, nationwide, where if a district attorney here, the issue was not that I think she was not interested in bringing charges,
Mm.
but it was that she tried to get them not charged.
So otherwise, would that be considered something like an obstruction of justice, or what is that
Right.
called?
Yeah, it's more of an obstruction. And I don't know. It's a tenuous. I think this is going to be a much more challenging case.
In what
Um,
way? And are we talking about challenging in a way for her, or challenging to prove that she did something wrong?
Challenging to prove.
Gotcha.
I mean, just the notion of being indicted is, I don't know that it could be more challenging but it's not required that you view the law a certain way. And I'm not sure what information Ms. Johnson did or didn't have, but I think her defense will probably be much more robust. I don't know that she'll just fold cards. Now she's facing a felony with some prison time, and she may decide, hey, you know what, now's a good time just to hang it up.
Mm.
Can I just walk away? Um, but it's rare that you see prosecutors prosecute. Um, and so in that sense, I would put that. This is way, way rare.
So you would say very low odds that anything is going to happen to her.
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I think once you bring that type of charge, you're likely going to go through with it. This is not likely to end by an agreement. Now, I will say the overwhelming, I think the public certainly disagrees with what her choice was. And so she's going to be arguing probably some First Amendment issues, some discretion. And I don't know, I haven't, dug into it, but you can think of the variety that we have among our existing elected officials. If you were to compare Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders, both were elected, both have, I think, very different views on issues, but both can take those views and be, fulfilling their elected duties. Uh, the district attorney does not have to charge every crime in their jurisdiction, and most of them do not. And so that I think is going to be kind of the center of it. But certainly, I think if she was off of it, then she should have wiped her hands of it and been done, and just not had anything to say at all. But when she tried to put her finger on the scale and tip it one way or another, then I think she messed up.
Gotcha. So with the potential charges against the former DA, would these be federal charges?
This would be state charges. It'd
Would be
be a
state charges.
felony. For an attorney, if you convicted of a felony, you lose your law license. So not only could you not be the DA, which I think you've already been relieved of those duties, but you can't practice law at all. So that it's the end of your career. Certainly, if you go to prison, it's just
Gotcha.
it makes it a little even more punishment. But yeah, I think for her, she's got a real issue on her hands.
So she may actually be in trouble.
Well, yeah. I mean, just getting indicted, I think, is the end of. If she does practice in the future, it's the stigma. Do what are you going to do? I don't know. You go do collections work.
Gotcha.
You're not going to be in criminal justice in any real capacity.
And what about the potentially federal hate crime indictment against the McMichaels and Mr. Bryant?
Right. Yeah. I
What
mean,
does that look like?
again, they can go forward here, but I'm not so sure. The feds may look at that and say, "Hey, you've got an indictment, you've got a life sentence, you've only got one life anyway. Do we want to spend the time and effort to proceed on another prosecution?"
And the money.
Right. Now, I understand that they have said that they will. And, if they do, they do. Again, I think the trial will, like the trial will lose some of its steam.
Gotcha.
I don't know that will be followed as tightly and attended and all of those things. Maybe so.
So as Richard, as the late great Richard Pryor would say, you could spend life in prison, die, be born again, and you going straight back to prison.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, at a certain point, it becomes a resources issue.
Right.
Now, in my view, maybe we spend way too many resources prosecuting people. Again, despite these convictions, the still most prosecuted person or most prosecuted class of people remains Black men.
Right.
And so I always tell people to be mindful of what you are asking for, because the primary recipient is Black men. And so, whether they do that or not, will be up to them. But, think broader concept when we think about what we're requesting in criminal justice.
Yeah. I hate to ask this question, but I believe that it's a fair question to ask. So one of the things that we do know is that they were walking the streets for a couple of months after the murder. Mm-hmm. And then under dubious circumstances, the video comes out that Mr. Bryant made. Why he decided to video shoot the McMichaels chasing down and literally trying to arrest and ultimately killing Mr. Ahmaud Arbery is I can't imagine. But he decides to make this video. And if I remember, the video was a trigger to a lot of stuff happening, them getting arrested, things actually rolling, and then obviously a large part of the evidence because they had visual evidence of this. And so that begs the question, and unfortunately I have to ask this, if it were not for that video, in your opinion, with the way things work, good, bad, or indifferent, would we even be here if it were not for that video evidence? That's the thing that I think about all the time.
Yeah, I don't think so. What video has done, whether this is bystander cell phone, but it gives you real time, real view, play by play, and we're able to analyze situations in the same way that the NFL analyzes whether or not somebody caught a football. And it takes out the he say, she say component of cases. And so the most interesting things about this is, you're right, the publisher of the video has to believe that they are in the right? Why in the hell else would you ever publish such a thing?
Crazy. I don't understand.
Well, and I think you're empowered by the fact that you haven't been arrested. You believe to some degree that you were in the right. And then you publish it and you find out, the public backlash is severe. But no, I would imagine, well, I mean, as it turns out, they'll spend the rest of their lives regretting publishing that video. But without
Exactly.
the video, I think the
I think they're
details
free men.
aren't there.
I think they're free men if it were not for that video, in my opinion.
Right.
I'm not an attorney, but I think if it were not for that video, they wouldn't have been arrested. I think they would still be free men. And so that, Mr. Bryan probably isn't the favorite person of anybody in that county right now.
And this is probably a good point just to mention to folks in general. This is the defense attorney side that do not publish on your social media pictures of yourself smoking marijuana, pictures of yourself with stacks of money, pictures of anything that you wouldn't want repeated in a courtroom.
So wait a minute. Let me back up. So for those fellas out in our lovely brothers who are in the music industry who are doing this all the time with the money, what's wrong with that? Break that down or unpack that for us and help us understand what the implications are.
Well, so if James Harden is in the nightclub throwing money, and James Harden has a multi-million-dollar contract. If my cousin John is in there and doesn't have a known means of income, all of these other types of things, this publication of information tends to not serve you well. And I mean, that's what you're seeing here in the video. But if you're saying, just by the way, more than half of the cases that I see involve some aspect of a person's social media, whether they have made threats, they've done all this stuff. And so maybe it just triggered in my mind, like, man, some people just don't get it. They are putting this information out there. Again, I'm speaking, if we're on Black Men Talk, to the overwhelming, still the majority of people prosecuted are Black men. Mm-hmm. And if I had a chance to tell them something that could probably prevent them from being prosecuted, it would be don't post things on social media that implicate you in criminal conduct. Sounds simple, but apparently not.
People get excited. Everybody wants to be the next social media star. So as a result, folks want to be in the limelight, but it could have some very disastrous implications for you in the long term. So let me ask you this. If we look at this trial and what it means, if we look at the trial of Ahmaud Arbery, if we look at the trial of George Floyd, and we look at the 20th century and the drive for civil rights, and we're in the 21st century, which is driven by mass media, and we look at cases like that. Do you kind of see this as a cry for justice or social justice, 21st century, similar to civil rights in the latter middle of the 20th century, or do you see it some way different?
I do see it different. Having not actually been a participant in the civil rights movement, I think it's kind of maybe the next civil rights frontier, if you will. And certainly in 2020, we saw the national protest out of George Floyd. We saw stuff, we've seen that over the years. You go back to Mike Brown, Ferguson, to Trayvon Martin. So there's been an awakening. I'm not sure that it's to the same degree of the civil rights movement. Particularly, I'll point out we haven't really seen the legislative changes that we wanted maybe to see, or that some people expected and hoped. And there's so many more competing issues now between gun rights, abortion, and all these other things. I do think, our country remains heavily divided on a lot of issues, and there's still a lot of progress to be made. But of course, remember, civil rights movement was whether or not black people would drink out of the same water fountain, whether, and so some of those things I think we are past. That doesn't mean that we're still being treated equally, and we're certainly not seeing equality in the areas of wages and income. We're not seeing equality in the areas of education. We're not seeing equality in the handling of black men in the criminal justice system. So if you looked at societal benchmarks, we're still not equal, but we do get to drink from the same water fountain.
I certainly understand it. With that being said, you kind of liken it to a new frontier. So there, because we're about 20 minutes out from the top of the hour, and I definitely want to make sure that we're getting the right information to our speakers. When we think about what cases like this mean for America, what are your thoughts? I mean, what is a case like this? And I know there are multiple cases that are being tried simultaneously, so there are a lot of different things there. We're not close. We're not even close to being closed on this case. And then you have these other cases that are still being tried out. But what do you see? What is your perception of what a case like this and similar means to Black America? Let's just narrow it down to this. What this means for Black America.
I think if we talk about what it means for Black America, and we were to look at the range of cases, where I would direct our attention to would be Rodney King. I believe Rodney King was 1995. Not absolutely positive of that. It may have been 92. I haven't, somebody could probably Google it and tell me. But what we saw in Rodney King, if you remember, was Rodney King being chased and beaten in the middle of the highway, and was actually captured, I think, by somebody from a cell phone video.
Yes.
From an apartment. But you saw that trial moved to Simi Valley, and the officers involved acquitted. And, that was a benchmark. Certainly after the civil rights movement, LA got set on fire. Reginald Denny got pulled out of a truck and beaten at Florence, and I'll say it was Florence and Normandy. That clash there, I think, was the beginning of an evolution in law enforcement, where you had more people, more African Americans entering law enforcement, seeing more African Americans in leadership positions. But it vacillated. It never made it all the way there. It didn't get up the hill, if you will. LAPD promised changes. Then we had Abdullah. I've forgotten his correct last name. He was in
New York.
Yeah, New York City. He was there's two in New York City. One was he was, I want to say, shot multiple times on a stoop with the cell phone, and then there was the rape of Abdullah at the precinct with a police baton.
Yes.
And so look at that, and then look at where you're at today. I think those things are substantially less likely to happen, primarily because of body cameras. And a slow evolution or a coming about or an awakening. So back then, people used to always say, "Oh no, the police would never do something like that." There was, I talked about the societal investment in law enforcement, and that's still there. We all still call 911 if we hear something outside at night. So that's intrinsic in society. But When you talk about where we're going to evolve to, it is knowing that the people that we're responding on the 911 aren't the same folks, and aren't always going to be our friends. And so I think the nation is more willing to scrutinize law enforcement than they ever have been before. So I don't think Rodney King, those officers get acquitted today.
Gotcha.
Now they ultimately were tried and convicted, but
Right. And you brought up a very good point when you said there are folks out there who's like, no, the law enforcement would never do anything like that. And the question would be, who said that? Because I don't know too many people in many of our communities who would say that no law enforcement would ever do that, because we've had this very peculiar relationship in predominantly Black communities and law enforcement.
yeah, and I mean, and you're right. We're going to get to the close here, but we have had, and it wouldn't have been in majority minority communities, but if you look at the prosecutorial trends over the years, if you remember the statistics that said 1 in 4 Black men had been in contact with the criminal justice system, the people who were making it onto juries were not us.
Right.
And that was tolerated at a greater degree, even here in Dallas. The person there was a manual called the Sparling Manual. There was a man named Miller L. who was tried 3 times for death, and the Sparling Manual told prosecutors to strike Black jurors. Negroes should not be on the jury. And this is after the civil rights movement. This is right around the time, and ultimately, though, Dallas, by voter participation, elected the first African American district attorney history of the state of Texas. What then happens? 28 and counting exonerations of wrongfully convicted, predominantly African American men. So you're seeing changes, in criminal justice as we see people engage more in society, as we see people of color matriculate into more leadership roles at local, state, and federal levels of government. And we've made strides in our education and educational levels. There's still a huge income gap, but Black folks in general are in a better position, although you have to temper that, but we're in a better position than we were back then.
So
our voices are heard better.
Right. So let me ask you this: as we look at this, and we look at the case, and I ask you the question very deliberately in terms of what this means to Black America, because I mean, quite frankly, we still understand that the highest demographic, and you mentioned this earlier, of when we look at the demographic that is incarcerated to the highest degree, it is Black men, and that has huge social consequences. It has huge political consequences. We look at this. Ahmaud Arbery is a Black man who was murdered for doing nothing other than exercising his free right to exercise in his neighborhood, so to speak. And so when we look at something like this, what do we take away from this and moving forward to improve the conditions and the circumstances for our community, not starting with, but in particular, to Black men, because we understand that the absence of Black men in our households, in our homes, who are fathers, who are husbands, who are leaders in our community, has had a catastrophic toll on our communities. How do we take something like this and make things better?
I think we remain empowered and honestly, I would say you probably should still remain fearful. With the notion being that fear prods attention and engagement, and being relaxed prods complacency. And so, if you were to say, in 2020, in the country that you claim citizenship in, that a black man could still be chased down and shot and killed, and it could still take months for a criminal investigation to get its legs. So you have to learn from that. I think that even though there's been some progress, that what we say is you're still a black person and you're still seen that way to many people. I don't believe if Ahmaud Arbery was not black, that the same thing would have happened if it was a white person. That's not the situation here. And so uh, we're still experiencing it. We're just maybe in a better position to say something about it. Again, I really encourage involvement in society, not just a good chat at the barbershop. I think we've got to be going to the polls, and it's hopefully a call to action. Because it's more will our next generations enjoy.
Right.
If you went with average lifespans, then you and I are maybe on the backside of that. Not that we're old, but just average numbers, and the amount of time it's taken to see the change, even that we've seen from Rodney King. So hopefully it will be that the next generations will be able to say, that George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, that their deaths moved the needle of society's conscience in a way that makes it unlikely to reoccur again.
So that would be wishful thinking, and I certainly hope that happens. But it's hard given the 400 some odd plus years of our lives, in the United States, yet to be America, that we look at the condition of our community of people, and in black men in particular, and we look at the historical devices that have been used to castigate, subjugate, exploit, and emasculate black men in order to contain the prosperity of black community is just going to go away because of a few benevolent people. And so that begs the question, as a community of people, short of infiltrating and taking a stronger position of being a part of the law enforcement community, what they say, if you can't beat them, join them. What other strategies do you look at when you consider the long and sordid history of this country since the founding of the initial militias to capture and return slaves? The majority of them men, but we know some women as well. And we look today and, we kind of look the other way when we see black men who are the most highly incarcerated group in the country, the way that they're treated on the street just because they happen to be black and male. What, in your opinion, from your perspective, do you do to, okay, this has come to an end?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. The biggest one that I preach, from way back, in my spring '89 days with Alpha Phi Alpha, a voteless people is a hopeless people. And if you have nothing, you should at least have your vote. Um, since then, I've probably evolved more. And one of the things that I think is also critical is, supporting black-owned businesses. There was a huge move, and now we've even gotten the national holiday of Juneteenth. But hopefully, if we understand that there was a reckoning that black-owned businesses needed economic support, not just from the black community, but hopefully from the community overall. And I think that we have to grow in our economic independence
What impact, just so people will understand, what impact do you believe that building a strong black economy nationally and or globally has on this issue?
Well, it's empowering. Remember, we're a capitalist society, and so the more economic ability you have, the more ability you have to do tons of things. You have the ability to provide a stronger education. You have a stronger household. You have all these different components that flow directly. And so one of the things you saw with the Black community was we spend more outside of our community than we spend in it. And in that way, we either needed to approach businesses, and that's what you saw by a number of national retailers, where they started shelving Black products or holding them accountable for where that money is going. But traditionally, we didn't believe that our wallet was also had any power. But Blacks are the number one consumers, and so if we can better grasp that, then I think we can influence a whole lot of things. And that's where you saw many large, airlines or whatever, making deliberate efforts. You see more Black people in advertising now. You see people of color in roles that traditionally they weren't seen in. And then you see businesses that traditionally made no effort, a little effort. And a lot of that arose out of, George Floyd. And so the issue is, after Chauvin's convicted, will we still continue with that same level of enthusiasm? Our memories become cyclical and we go on to the next battle, and then we start doing other things. So it's to try and build habits that are enduring. And that's each individual person, it's one brick at a time. But I think we're improving, certainly shows like this, to get that story out, to cause the engagement, to have the discussion. I think all of those things move the needle forward.
Gotcha. Makes sense. I'll tell you what, we are just about out of time, but final thoughts on this particular case. I think we're down to a little bit less than 3 minutes. Just final thoughts on this case. And, I have to throw this in, and this is actually something that I think Jimmy probably would have asked. Do you think there would have been as much furor if those who had exacted this crime on Mr. Arbery were Black? And what do we do about that? Because that is just as big of a problem as a situation like this.
Right. Yeah. The short answer is no. We still lead, as our leading cause of death for Black men is not law enforcement, it's other Black men. And, it's recognizing where we need to go. I think if you get closing thoughts on Ahmaud Arbery, again, I think you have to leave it with a healthy amount of fear. And if you're a Black man, you're a Black father, you don't want that to happen to your son. So, do something to be engaged. This is a long-term solution, but hopefully people are more involved. And we're not just sitting by, and make that involvement in every aspect of your life. And that's, I think, the best way to honor George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. To say, let me step forward and not continue to do things the same way. Let me participate in juries when I'm called to be on the jury duty. And let me say something when I see a police officer doing something they shouldn't be doing. But also say something when you see a Black man doing something they shouldn't be doing to another Black man.
Absolutely. I think those are outstanding closing comments on this case. It takes something that our listeners can take away from this. And as we usually do, we always close with a brief word of prayer. We want to thank you again for joining us and lending us your perspective and your expertise on this. To our listeners who are out there, Councilor Wilson's contact information is at the bottom of the YouTube distribution that you see out there. So if you need his contact information and need some legal services, if his information is there. and we want to make sure that those who are contributing to us, we absolutely support. So make sure, folks, that you give him a call if you have something that needs to be taken into account that needs legal services. So now we will close out this show, and if we don't talk before then, Brother Wilson, of course, we wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas and a happy transition into the new year. Continue to be safe.
Absolutely.
And
Thank
I will
you so
close
much.
out with a brief word of prayer. Dear Lord and Master, we come before you this evening, thanking you for blessing us to see another day. We thank you, Father, for bringing Brother Wilson. We thank you for the work that he has done in our communities and with those families that he has helped support. Father, we ask you continue to bless him and his family, his health. Father, that he may continue to do your mighty works on earth, Father. We thank you, Father. We ask that you would continue to bless Jimmy's health as well, that you would get him back to 100% as soon as possible, Father. And we thank you for bringing us together as brothers as we continue to focus on solving problems within our communities. Father, in your precious name we pray. Amen. And I believe, absolutely, and I believe Jimmy will now cue up the closing music and we will close out this show. Good night, everyone.
All right. Good night, y'all.
Okay. Yeah, so I was trying to figure out, what that noise was. I was like, I usually don't get this noise. And so it was because he did not have on headphones. I noticed that.